Good morning. Would you pray with me, please? May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. These hands have changed over time. They were once much smaller when they belonged to a tiny baby who reached up and grasped hold of the finger of his mother, whose loving caress gave life-affirming connection and comfort to her firstborn. These hands held rattles and stuffed animals and the corner of a blanket. In the mouth of that baby, two fingers of the right hand acted as a pacifier, gently ushering in sleep each night. These hands grew into the hands of a boy and so quickly into the hands of a man. Along the way, they petted animals, picked up toads, threw and caught footballs, held slingshots and rocks and toys of all kinds. They've turned the pages of books, too many to count. The right hand has held crayons and pencils and pens, drawing or writing and thus creating. That hand has communicated on paper thoughts and feelings, including heartfelt expressions of joy as well as sadness, letting others know they're not alone in their grief. These hands have touched shoulders and squeezed arms to say in ways that words cannot, I'm sorry, your pain is my pain too. These hands have been folded in prayer again and again. These hands have held other hands. The right one has been extended to and grasped by others to convey friendship and trust, to say hello. These hands have held the hands of one woman in particular, whose hand's familiar softness penetrates skin and reaches the heart. These hands held a newborn daughter moments after her birth and felt the sudden immense weight of the lifelong responsibility of caring for her with every ounce of one's being. These hands continue to do all they can to assure her security and happiness. These hands were extended to receive authority from a bishop to preach the word and serve our Lord. These hands have held the Bible and hammers and plenty of fried chicken in obedience to that ordination. These hands have also carried the tension that can seep into the body all the way to the fingertips from the overflow of the burden found at times in such calling. These hands have grasped purpose and hope. They've worked for good, striving to make the world better than it would be without them. These hands, however, are not only instruments for good. The truth is that these hands are very capable of destroying rather than building up. They can threaten, cajole, insult, or scare. They can stop you in your tracks and tell you you aren't wanted. They can tear you down and wear you down and even run you away. If allowed, these hands can do great harm. They can work against rather than for or with. These hands can be a source of violence, causing pain, heartache, or even death. They could work to create suffering. They can steal from, they can deface, they can choose evil over good. If permitted, they can be the hands of the devil, and so his seed. These hands are capable of bad as much as good. Or these hands can do nothing. They can remain folded, and sometimes they have when gloved in fear. As the beneficiaries of free will, we're always given the choice what to do with our hands. We can reach out for that which is good, or we can grasp evil. Every time we move our hands or fail to move our hands, we act one way or the other, doing that which is constructive and positive, or that which is negative and lessens or even destroys. The choice is always within our hands. Jesus' disciples were faced with such a choice there with him on the side of a mountain near the Sea of Galilee, according to John's Gospel. A large crowd had followed Jesus after witnessing his healing powers. Seeing the crowd approaching, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" Jesus was testing him. Philip replied with cynicism, "Even 8 months' wages wouldn't buy enough to give each of them a little bit." His focus was on the practical, the unimaginative. In other words, Philip chose to sit on his hands in a manner of speaking. There was too much to do for these people, so he advocated doing nothing. Keeping one's hands to oneself is a choice we often make. The question remains whether such a choice is good or bad. In this instance, Jesus would have considered it a poor choice. Another of his disciples, Andrew, spotted a boy with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but even Andrew quickly pointed out that it was so little food for so many people, about 5,000 in the crowd that day, and that was just the number of men. Women and children, sadly, evidently weren't even counted in that day and time, literally. Jesus could have followed the sentiment of his disciples and just thrown up his hands, but he didn't. His hands had a different message for the crowd. His hands were open rather than closed. So Jesus told his disciples to have the people sit down, and then with his hands he took those scant 5 loaves from the boy, gave thanks, and distributed them to the thousands seated. Likewise, he did so with the 2 fish. Now let's be clear, Jesus didn't just subdivide the bread into teeny tiny pieces for a symbolic gesture. By power that could only come from heaven above, he multiplied the blessing of that bread so many times that everyone ate to his or her fill. In fact, after the people had finished eating, the disciples, at Jesus' urging, gathered up the leftovers and filled 12 baskets with fragments of bread. Now, these baskets were likely satchels carried by travelers for storing a day's worth of food. The number seems significant given the number of apostles. Their baskets were filled, so they left with more than they came with that day. The people witnessing this miraculous sign remarked that Jesus must indeed be the prophet who was to come into the world. These hands of Jesus performed an act of sharing that stretches the imagination. In fact, it was a little too far of a stretch for my father's imagination. He preferred to see this miracle another way. He figured that maybe once the members of the crowd were seated and they saw Jesus with the 5 loaves of bread and the 2 fish, they reached into their own baskets and started sharing their food as well. In this way, everyone was satisfied. Now, while I have to admit that there's nothing in the text suggesting that this is what occurred, nor in any of the other Gospels, this being the one miracle of Jesus, aside from the resurrection, appearing in all 4 Gospel accounts, nevertheless, it's an interesting thought. Actually, in some way, that scenario might be an even greater miracle, for it would mean that thousands of hands were suddenly inspired by Jesus' hands to share with the empty hands around them. In her collection of teachings entitled No Greater Love, Mother Teresa tells the following story. One night a man came to our house and told me there is a family with 8 children. They have not eaten for days. I took some food with me and went, she writes. When I came to that family, I saw the faces of those little children disfigured by hunger. There was no sorrow or sadness in their faces, just the deep pain of hunger. I gave the rice to the mother. She divided the rice in two and went out carrying half the rice. And when she came back, I asked her, "Where did you go?" She gave me this simple answer: "To my neighbors. They are hungry also." Mother Teresa adds, "I was not surprised that she gave. Poor people are really very generous." The people on the mountainside with Jesus were likely poor as well, so maybe they were also generous. And when Jesus held up so few loaves of bread and fish, well, maybe they wanted to help him feed the crowd, and they reached into their baskets and gave what they had. Maybe none of them had very much, but in the hands of God it was enough, more than enough, for everyone to be satisfied. I don't discount the miracle, though. I believe that in the hands of Jesus, those 5 loaves and 2 fish really were multiplied again and again so as to feed the thousands of persons hungry on the mountainside that day. I believe that because I've witnessed in my life the power of God to multiply blessings beyond the imagination. I saw Jesus' hands multiplying meager loaves and fish in the hands of one Helen Wallace. Helen was an elderly woman with severe back problems. She lived much of her adult life in a metal brace. And she had almost no money to her name. She lived in a tiny government-subsidized apartment in Kings Mountain. And she was a dear friend of my wife, her mother, and me. Helen had hardly anything of monetary value, but she had everything, because she had the love of Jesus Christ emanating from her heart. Folks would visit her for Bible study and for prayer, and I've rarely known a home where I've felt the peace of Christ as deeply. In fact, Kristen would often laugh at me about this, but whenever we would visit Helen, almost every time, within a short while, I would start finding myself falling asleep because I got so relaxed sitting there in her peaceful presence. So if you're fighting sleep right now, let's just say it's for the same reason, that you're at peace in this place. In Helen's hands, Jesus multiplied blessings beyond what the eye could see. 5 loaves and 2 fish, almost nothing really, in the hands of a little boy became in the hands of Jesus more than enough to satisfy 5,000 men plus countless more women and children. Whether or not the miracle played out as my father suggests, I believe Jesus does desire that we use our hands as he did his, to share with others abundantly. Food, of course, is not the only thing we can share in abundance. The good news of Jesus' life-giving love is something like the bread Jesus broke and broke and broke on the hill beside the Sea of Galilee that can be shared with others and never run short. In fact, there is always an excess supply left over to feed others. It's that abundant good news which has brought each of us to this place of worship this morning. You may have grown up in a family who has always come to church and have known nothing different. Nonetheless, the gospel in somebody's hands brought you here because it touched someone's heart in your family years ago. Or you may have only recently come to know Jesus. Clearly, you know that the gospel handed to you brought you here. Or you may not really feel comfortable yet saying that you know Jesus. You're still trying to figure out who he is. But mark my word, he knows you, and he's been reaching out to you with his hands. You as well are here because of the gospel in someone's hands. The good news of Christ's love, carried in hands from generation to generation, is why we are all here today. It's what Jesus has been distributing to feed our souls through the hands of Christians for 2,000 years. These hands have carried loaves and fishes that didn't seem like all that much at first. And yet lives have been changed so significantly by those modest gifts when shared with others hungering for righteousness. Jesus told his disciples to gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost. He's still telling his disciples, you and me, and all of those who follow him today, to gather up the leftovers, those persons who may feel left out, who feel discarded and overlooked, who feel unwanted, so that no one may be lost. We're to use these hands in sharing Christ's love, reaching out with warmth and compassion so that all are gathered into God's kingdom. These hands are how Jesus Christ shares his life-giving love with all the world.